It's wonderful to see all of you. I'm thrilled for both Servant Group and for our community to have the opportunity to examine what has become obviously a critical issue for all of us. There aren't very many Americans who are not interested in Islam, in Islam's beliefs, in Islam's past, in Islam's future, and the impact of Islamic culture on Western culture. In fact, I did a real quick survey of books in print on the internet day before yesterday and discovered that since September the 11th, a year ago, 432 books have been published on the issue of Islam, Islamic culture, and the impact on the West. Of those, some 140 have already gone into second, third, or fourth printings. So this is obviously a topic that a lot of folks are interested in. Your presence here attests to that as well. Sometime before September 11th, to have called together a group of businessmen and pastors and ministry leaders in Williamson County to talk about the impact of Islam on the economy would have drawn about, 2 people. But today it is a vital aspect of all of our interests. Daniel Pipes, who is perhaps America's foremost policy expert on the Middle East and on Islamic politics, recently said in an interview that for most Americans, because of the torrent of new information coming from the media and from various books, Islam more than ever is an enigma wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, partly misquoting Winston Churchill. And I find that the more information we have about Islam and about Muslim cultures, the more confused we become. We become very conflicted because we're told on the one hand that Islam is a very peaceful world religion, and on the other hand, we see evidence of the fact that those who take their faith most seriously in Islam have great antipathy toward America and toward the West. And we wonder why that is. Is it a matter of foreign policy? Is it a matter of economic policy? Or is there something doctrinally and dogmatically at the heart of Islam that is opposed to the West? One of the things that I hope to do this morning is to answer some of those questions and to address directly some of the things that will affect you, your ministries, your businesses, and your families in the days to come. You've probably heard a lot of things about Islam. You may have done some serious reading. Some of you may have even gone to Borders or Barnes & Noble and picked up a copy of the inscrutable Quran and tried to plow your way through it, maybe making all the way up to, say, Surah 62 before you finally just lost interest and gave up. But however familiar you are with Islam, there are at least 7 things that I think that we as Americans, we as business people and ministry leaders in this day and time need to understand about Islam. And the first is the conflict between Islam and the West is not new. And in fact, the conflict between Islam and the West has been a part of the character of the relationship of Islam to the world from the very beginning. You may know that Islam grew out of a series of visions that Muhammad, a member of a very prestigious what we might even call a royal family from a Central Arabian tribe that had its commercial headquarters in the city of Mecca in the first part of the 7th century. Mecca was a caravanning center where the world met, in a sense. And Muhammad grew up hearing the stories of all of the great religions and all of the great cultures at the crossroads of the world in that caravanning center. He was disturbed, clearly, by the fact that there were so many variant beliefs and there was no clear and simple way to understand truth. He went on a very deep and profound search, and in his mid-40s, he began to have a series of visions, which were ultimately reduced to writing. And those visions, some 114 of those visions, became the essence of the Quran. They are called surahs. But among the things that the visions revealed to him was that there was but one truth and there was but one God. And his purpose in life was to be the prophet of that God and bring the entire world into submission to that God. The God was the chief of the pantheon of the Arabian religion at the time. There was a temple in the center of the city of Mecca, a large stone structure called the Kaaba. And this temple had literally altars to hundreds, some would even say thousands of deities. But the chief of the desert deities, a jinn, or what in some Eastern religions called a demon, that the chief of these jinn was Allah. And Muhammad identified that chief jinn as the one true God, and all of the other jinns as merely subservient angels or demons. And so all of the other religions of the world were thus reduced to secondary status, but they were absorbed into this new kind of eclectic, sort of federal system of religion. From there, Muhammad began to receive visions about a new cultural and social order, a law code, a system of economy, a way of structuring family life and relationships. He began to gather to himself a number of disciples. They became very disruptive to the orderly commerce of the city of Mecca, and in the year 622 they were expelled, sent away. They went into exile to a nearby desert oasis town called Yathrib. And there in Yathrib, they began to thrive. They also came into contact with the Jewish community. There was a nasty little scene in which some 450 Jews were slaughtered, and thus began Islam's march on the world. The vision was to literally conquer the world. And beginning there, then later in the year 630, going back to Mecca, conquering Mecca with now a fledgling desert army, Islam began to march on the world. And almost immediately, it came into contact with Christianity and with Judaism, both of which are mentioned specifically in the Quran, the followers of which are called the people of the book. They're to receive special treatment according to the Islamic approach to the conquest of the world. But it's not the kind of special treatment that most of us would particularly care to have. Innumerable quotes from the Quran, often taken very much out of context, can be horrific in their description of violence to be done to people who ought to know better because they are people of the book. And thus the conflict began. My sole point is simply that from the very beginning, Islam showed itself to be in conflict, particularly with Jews and Christians. And that conflict began to spread. As Islam began to conquer the Christian countries of the Middle East, you have to remember that in the 7th century, all of the Middle East was universally Christian, and it was, in fact, the heart of the Christian world. 6 of the 7 patriarchates were actually in the Middle East. And gradually, over the course of the end of the 7th, the beginning of the 8th, and into the 9th century, all of the Christian Middle East, all of Christian Africa, all of the Christian realm of the southern Mediterranean, upward into the Iberian Peninsula, what is today Spain and Portugal, were all swiftly conquered by the armies of Islam. After the 9th century, there was a simmering feud between Islam and Christianity, which led ultimately in the 10th and 11th centuries to the Crusades. The Crusades lasted all the way until the time of Napoleon in the 19th century. In fact, Napoleon's last great military conquest prior to coming back to France to assume control of the then chaotic revolutionary government in Paris was to conquer Egypt and then ultimately to march toward Jerusalem. Following the collapse of the crusading movement, we rush through the 19th century, which essentially concludes with a great cataclysmic war that we call World War I, that the British call the Great War, which had as a central feature the conquest of the Middle East. The battle lines were drawn not primarily between Germany and the rest of Europe, but the battle lines were drawn between the great alliance between Germany and the Ottoman Empire. That led to the creation, following World War I, of every single one of the Middle Eastern nations that we know today, except Egypt and Afghanistan, the only 2 great nations of the Middle East that have enduring foundations longer than the 20th century. Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, these are all creations of the 20th century. So the very first thing that I want you to grasp is that the conflict that we've got is not a new conflict. It seems new to us because it has taken on a new and virulent form. But it is a very ancient conflict that goes back to the very beginnings of Islam. The second thing that is important, I think, for us to understand is that no country has ever converted to Islam peacefully or willfully. No country. Every single nation that has ever converted to Islam has converted under the sword. Every single one. Now there are some conflicting arguments about the conversion of many of the islands of Indonesia. And to be sure, the Mosaic nation of Indonesia is a complex question and a complex subject. But leaving aside the complex history of Indonesia, which we could argue was also conquered by Islam, every single other Islamic country was conquered by the armies of Islam, did not convert willfully or peacefully. The third thing that we probably need to know is that no Islamic country has ever created, maintained, or sustained a middle class. This is actually quite purposeful because the Quran creates a stratified society in which there are rulers and elites and then everybody else. While there have been numerous times throughout Islamic history where great wealth has been produced, that wealth has been generally concentrated in the hands of a very few elites. That has incredible economic implications for us. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Fourth thing that we need to know is that no Islamic country or culture has ever produced scientific or commercial progress of any measurable sort. Again, there have been times when mathematicians and scientists have emerged from the Islamic world. Things like the great astrolabe, which was an instrument to measure both distance and led to the measurement of latitude for navigators, emerged from the Islamic world. But what we have to remember is that the great feats of architecture and engineering and math and science emerged from the Islamic world after the Muslims conquered the Byzantines, and it was the Byzantine scholars who had come into the core of the Janissaries who ultimately produced most of these great achievements. So even the great achievements of Islamic science and math during, say, the Middle Ages was built upon foundations of the Greek Byzantines, who also lent their knowledge to the Romans and thus provided the means for the Romans to do things like build their aqueducts and create their arches and build their domes. We all know that the Romans borrowed from the Greeks, but we need to understand that the Muslims did as well. The fifth thing that we need to know is that no Muslim country has ever produced a Shakespeare or a Milton or a Christopher Wren or a Bach or a Beethoven. There is a monolithic form to Islamic culture, art, music, literature, ideas. And that monolithic form has never produced the profusion, the flowering that Western civilization has. Now, that does not mean that there have not been prodigies. That does not mean that there have not been brilliant poets. That does not mean that there weren't individuals who rose above the monolithic consensus of the culture, but nothing like what we have seen in Western civilization. Nothing like it. The sixth thing that we need to understand about Islam is that no Islamic country has ever produced political stability, much less freedom, apart from military force. It's one of the reasons why most Islamic countries are military dictatorships, and always have been. We don't see anything in the Islamic world except those things which are, quite frankly, apostasies of Islamic law, as in, for instance, Turkey, where there is produced any form of stability. And some would argue that there's not a whole lot of stability in Turkey either. The seventh thing that we need to understand is that most Muslims do not know all of these 6 previous propositions and do not believe them. And that's the real crunch for us. And that is where some of the disjunction, the confusion occurs, because the fact is that most Muslims are not intent on conquering the world. Most Muslims do not have innate, inherent antipathy to the West. Most Muslims are like most Christians. They don't know a whole lot about what the Quran says. They're very selective in their faith. And in fact, in Islam, that is a perfectly acceptable stance, because in Islam, there is no perfect Quranic orthodoxy. In other words, doctrine is not particularly important for the ordinary Muslim, and they are taught that systematically from the mosque. It is not necessary for a good Muslim to know much at all about Islam. In fact, as long as a good Muslim practices faithfully the 5 pillars of the faith, things like the Shahada, the profession of faith, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, and the regular Rakateen prayer, things like the lifetime journey to Mecca, the Hajj, the regular participation in the zidlaq, the tithe or tax, and of course the once a year observance of the great festival, Ramadan, the fasting festival. Apart from that, if you do those things, you're a good Muslim, period. Those 5 things bring discipline and order. Those 5 things bring a sense of piety and purpose. Those 5 things provide the means by which this works, righteousness, faith function. You need to understand that, therefore, a Muslim can have a complete worldview disjunction from everything that we've just talked about. Muslims may know a lot about history. They may keep a long record of wrongs, but they are not connecting that long vision of history with all of the incendiary quotes from the Quran, because most of them have never read the Quran. That's something that we need to be very, very clear about. When we go to Barnes & Noble and pick up a Penguin Classics copy of the Quran, and we start reading through there and we start seeing that the Jews are to be boiled in oil or something, that does not necessarily mean that the Pakistani that we greet every day at the convenience store and that we buy our coffee from actually wants to boil Jews in oil. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, Muslims are like most people. They have lives. They do stuff. They have families. And as a result, they get distracted from what we might consider to be the weightier things of life. They're like most Christians. How many Christians really know what, say, the book of Obadiah says? Now, how many Christians are up to date on the intricacies of Nahum's prophecy? Much less Luke's gospel. So part of it, we have to understand, most Muslims aren't reading the Quran because they're people. Secondly, the Quran was written in classical Arabic. Something akin to classical academic medieval Latin. Any of you classical academic medieval Latin scholars? Conversant in that? Well, imagine if Jesus had said, now I'm going to give you good news, but you can't ever translate it out of this language. That's what Muhammad did. Muhammad, in order to ensure the purity of the surahs, argued in the hadith, a collection of his sayings, that the Quran was never to be translated, and thus a good Muslim will not read it in its sullied, muddied, translated forms. How many of those boys rioting in the streets of the Gaza Strip today do you think know classical Arabic? Well, if they don't know classical Arabic and they're good Muslims, they're not reading the Quran at all, ever. So it's only the incredibly well-educated students in the radical seminaries along the Pakistan-Afghan border, people like Osama bin Laden, who actually read the Quran. That means that most Muslims don't know these things. Now, most mullahs, most of the teachers in the mosques do. What happens in human history when you have an elite kind of priesthood that has all of the knowledge and all of the power to move the masses to do whatever they wish? The opportunities for corruption and manipulation are rampant. And oftentimes the most radical of ideas and forces takes center stage. All of this is really important for us to understand because of a couple of things. We need to understand that Islam is at war with the West. It is at antipathy with Christianity and with Jews. But most Muslims don't know that. This separates for us, I think, something that is really important, and that is that there are tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of millions, perhaps as many as 1.5 billion people on the planet who are under the thrall of Islam, and whose worldviews do not coincide with the teachings of their own faith. There's this worldview crisis inherent in the Islamic world. And that is the point of mission. That's the point of opportunity. That's the point of hope. How many people do you suppose are in the Middle East today who would like to see a middle class emerge? How many people do you suppose there are in the Middle East who would set aside their radicalism gladly if they had a stable political system? If they had the opportunity for freedom? How many would actually be appalled if they discovered that there were indeed great promises for suicide bombers, for terrorist cells, for leaders like Osama bin Laden? That there are thousands, tens of thousands of ordinary Muslims out there who are living with this kind of worldview tension, this worldview crisis. We all know what that's like, because many of us have lived with that worldview crisis, and it was the point of determination in our own lives to take one path or another. It's one of the things that in the Bible we see as the point of conviction. This is one of the reasons why I think that American foreign policy and American attempts to reach the Muslim world through missions, American attempts to do business with the Muslim world have often been very, very misplaced and misguided. We have an incredible opportunity. The church spends a pittance on reaching this massive part of the world that is unreached by the gospel. A pittance. The statistics are appalling. And while they are not entirely accurate, what we can say is that less than 1% of all of the mission dollars to reach the world wind up in this wide swath of the Islamic Middle East, across North Africa, and into the heart of Asia. That's a pittance. Now, the history of Christian missions to Islam is admittedly rather dismal. But part of the reason for that is that this worldview crisis has not always been readily recognized. We tend to think of the average Iraqi, say, as our enemy. In fact, that is the attitude of most Americans, that the Iraqis are our enemies. If you've ever met an Iraqi, you would really quickly discover that they're delightful, wonderful people with a zest for life and a hunger for truth and a love for their families and a desire for peace. And so, in the same way that the Muslims have a kind of worldview conflict, people in the Christian world and in Christian ministries tend to have a worldview conflict when they're dealing with the issue of the Islamic peoples. Our foreign policy has often been to exploit the raw resources and to funnel the great wealth from those raw resources, like oil, for instance, into the hands of very, very few. Kermit Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's son, became an academic expert in matters of the Middle East in the years prior to World War II. He wrote a remarkable book entitled Arabs, Oil, and History, in which he argued that American foreign policy toward the Middle East needed to be aimed at two things. Number one, ensuring an open society with open communication, and distributing wealth as widely and as far as possible without allowing it to concentrate in the hands of a few sheiks and kings and feudal tribal lords. What Roosevelt argued was that if we continue to empower the current societal structures, we create an atmosphere where the resurgent hatred of the Middle East for the West will become the dominant matter of foreign affairs for the United States in the 21st century. Here's this incredibly prophetic chapter where he actually says that if we make billionaires out of a few feudal chiefs and sheikhs, that we will actually unleash terror upon the world which would visit even our peaceful homes here in America. What he suggested was that we take the foreign policy position of our founding fathers, and in fact of the United States all the way up through to the time of his dad, Teddy Roosevelt, which was that most favored trade status would go only to those countries that allowed a modicum of openness. Did you know, for instance, that American foreign policy in the State Department demands that we not deal in a substantive way with slave trading states, except in the Middle East? Slavery is legal in most of the nations of the Middle East. Egypt and Jordan are the chief exceptions. Did you know that child molestation is legal in most of the states of the Middle East? We actually have economic leverage to actually bring reform to those kinds of heinous offenses, but we make exceptions in our foreign policy because we want to keep the flow of oil going. So what Kermit Roosevelt says is that we should apply evenly and consistently our concerns. And if we apply them evenly and consistently, we can bring economic leverage and bring openness. And Roosevelt's argument is that freedom and openness will ultimately bring about reform and not revolution. Closed societies breed revolution. Open societies breed reform. He also argues that no nation that is closed to missionary activity should receive preferential foreign policy treatment by the United States. He says the history of the United States is clear. Where the gospel is allowed to operate, not given preferential treatment, but just allowed freedom, the opportunities to bring about real reform are greatly enhanced. And he goes on to cite a number of instances. He argues, for instance, this is prior to World War II. He argues, for instance, that if the United States was to ever see any kind of democratic and economic stability in countries like Japan, Japan would have to be opened up to the gospel. That's exactly what MacArthur attempted to do following World War II. And that is precisely why institutions that depend upon a Christian worldview have, in fact, flourished in a non-Christian country like Japan. The ideas become a part of the currency of the world. But where the ideas are not a part of the currency, we cannot expect those ideas to ultimately take root separated from their tap source. Roosevelt goes on and he argues, not only must we be consistent in the application of our foreign policy, and not only must we ensure that these countries are open to missionary activity, but our giving, our foreign aid must be directed to grassroots institutions rather than to monolithic governmental structures. This is something that the Peace Corps learned in Africa years ago. You don't just give somebody like Mengistu lots and lots of tractors. He will use those tractors to oppress his people, not help them. Instead, what you've got to do is you've got to go to non-governmental services on the ground in the villages so that education, so that genuine aid can take root. Alas, that is not the way our foreign policy has operated in the Middle East. What Roosevelt says is that should terror spring to the forefront of the world stage once again in the 21st century, America will find itself fighting off one rogue nation after another in small, petty, strategic wars, and they will never end. I think Roosevelt was very much onto something. As a child raised with catechism and as a child raised with a world view, literally, in Teddy's household, he was a child who understood the notion that ideas have consequences. And that ideas allowed to spring up and to gain root will ultimately have causes and effects far beyond what we can possibly even imagine. Here is why I am so hopeful about the Middle East. Muslims are hungry for freedom. Muslims are hungry for opportunity. They have seen the wealth that oil can produce, and they desire to see it spread throughout their entire culture, their entire society. But Islam is the greatest obstacle to achieving that. Therefore, I believe that at this moment, we have the most remarkable strategic opportunity to reach North Africa, across into the heart of the Middle East, across the wide swath of Asia, and down into the Pacific Rim in a way that we haven't been able to in the last 150 years. I believe that this opportunity can best be seized if we will exercise our own stewardship, both as Americans leading the foreign policy decisions of the world and as Western Christians with a missionary imperative to bring the hope and the light and the life of the gospel to the world. And we can start right here in Nashville. There are Muslims in our neighborhoods. There are Muslims in our businesses. There are Muslims in the places that we frequent. We have an opportunity to begin something that will change, I believe, the world. And it's not simply by pulling a lever in a voting booth. It's an opportunity to change the world one person at a time, one life at a time. My son has spent the last 3 months in Turkey with Servant Group International's team. It's my youngest son, my baby. And as a 19-year-old in a Muslim country, his life has been transformed. He loves the Islamic peoples of the world. And he yearns to see them come to freedom in Christ. And he has learned that these Muslim peoples are people. And that relationships with them is the door to open up their lives and to discover that worldview conflict and to begin to build a hope for the future. I don't think we have to go off to Turkey to do that. Although I think it is our responsibility to make sure that some people do go off to Turkey to do that, or do go off to northern Iraq and plant a school and begin to teach children the principles of life from a discipleship perspective. I do think that we need to invest ourselves in the continent of Africa like never before, lest the continuing conquest of Islam sweep down from the desert realms and into the heart of Africa. And I think right now we have a chance like never before to do something amazing. That's why I'm grateful for SGI and for opportunities like this morning to talk about these issues.
Dr. Grant, when you referred earlier, did they use those names interchangeably?
Yes.
In their own culture?
A jinn, Jinn, is an ancient Arabian mythological creature that's something on the order, somewhere between the genie in the bottle and a dragon. And the jinns could be, and this goes back to Zoroastrianism, where you have the god of wickedness and darkness, Mazda, and sorry if you drive one. And the god of light and life, Zoroaster, and which is a dualistic system. So jinns could be good or bad. You could have a good genie or a bad genie.
Could you explain exactly what jihad is?
Jihad is holy war, literally. There are two aspects to holy war, just like there are two aspects to spiritual warfare for a Christian. There is the great conflict within. And the Quran makes it clear that the first battlefield of jihad is the Muslim's own heart. So jihad begins with the ummah, the true believer in Islam, in their heart. They have to expel, through holy warfare, anything and everything that would deter them from the task of being a good Muslim. But jihad also has very, very practical outward applications. And this is very evident in the Quran itself. And I won't belabor this point, but it is important for us to know that this This is not a matter of arcane interpretation. I want you to see that this is pretty clear and straightforward. Kill the infidels, and God will torment them and cover them with shame. Surah 9:14. Strike terror in the hearts of the enemies of God, who are also your enemies. Surah 8:60. I will instill terror in the hearts of the infidels, smite them above their necks, smite them on their fingertips, cut them off. It is not you who slay them, rather it is Allah. Go forth, be martyrs. Ummah, take neither Jews nor Christians for your friends. They are friends with one another. Whoever of you seeks their friendship will become one of their number. Allah does not guide such infidels. Prophet, make war on the infidels and the hypocrites and deal rigorously with them. Hell shall be their home and evil fate. Fight against such of those to whom the scriptures were given, as believe neither in Allah nor the last day, who do not forbid what Allah and his prophet have forbidden, and do not embrace the true faith until they pay tribute out of hand and are utterly subdued. Muhammad is Allah's prophet. Those who follow him are ruthless to the infidels, but merciful to one another. And I could go on and on and on. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of just double-spaced text that pretty well portrays the character and the nature of jihad. Yes?
2 questions. One is, what is your perspective on
Yes, Franklin Graham is right. Franklin Graham is courageous. Franklin Graham has taken a lot of hits for all of the rest of us for simply saying, you know what? This is what Islam is, and this is who Muhammad was, and this is what we're facing right now. The other thing that doesn't get much play is that Franklin Graham has been involved in Muslim missions for at least 20 years. Through Samaritan's Purse, he has been in Lebanon, he has been in Syria, he has been reaching out to the children of Muslims, building churches among Muslims. So the first thing that I want to say is I endorse Franklin Graham and what he has said and what he has done. He's been very courageous and taken huge hits for it. And what Franklin Graham has done is not simply spoken out against Islam. In fact, he said very, very little about it. What he has said is that Christianity is true and everything else is false. And he has backed that up with his actions in the Middle East, caring for the least and the last. Moving on to the bigger part of your question, what do I think about our foreign policy toward Iraq? It's very clear that Saddam Hussein is a great danger. The biblical form of warfare, by the way, is to crush the head of the serpent. I do think that our foreign policy ought to be aimed at somehow ameliorating or eliminating Saddam Hussein and his power and the Ba'athist Party in Iraq. It is very dangerous. They do have weapons of mass destruction. They have been inclined to slaughter their own people. Genocide is a legitimate political tool for them. And so he is very dangerous. However, widespread warfare may not be the best approach to accomplish that end. In fact, as we saw in the Gulf War, sometimes that kind of widespread warfare actually only entrenches those like Saddam who are in power. And so I think that the Bush administration has been wise to begin by pressuring disarmament, but beating the drums of war is not necessarily going to be the means of eradicating the world of the Saddams. The final part of your question is, how do we have a frontal assault on Islam? The same way that we had frontal assaults on Druidism and occultism in the West when places like Germany came under the weight of missionary activity during the early Middle Ages. And that is, we bring the gospel in word and deed. We care for people and we proclaim the truth. We go in to places where we're not wanted and we speak the truth. We go where it's illegal and we speak the truth. We go and we risk our lives and we speak the truth. And we back that up with deeds.